Hello there. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through how to set up a rig in VoxEdit using the built-in IK chain system. First thing we're going to do is we're going to build an IK chain in one of the legs. And then once we've tested that, we will duplicate it across, test the other leg, build up the rest of the body, and then we'll build an IK chain in one of the arms, make sure it works, and then we're going to copy it over to the other side, duplicate it over to the other side, and check that it works there too, so that we're set up with a fully ready to animate IK rig. For those that are new to IK, the first thing I'll mention is FK. So FK is forward kinematics, and that means that when you move a parent like this, a parent node, all of the children nodes will follow 100%. There's no bending of joints, there's no planting of feet on the ground as you move the hips. But when you have an IK system set up, in our case, we have 4 chains, one in each leg, one in each arm. Then when I move the hips, you'll see that the feet stay planted on the ground because they're trying to stay in that location. So the kinematics is inversed, as well as in the hands. The hands try to stay in place, which then allows us to create poses much more quickly. Though there are drawbacks to animating with IK, and I will cover that, as well as the considerations you need to have when trying to build an IK rig in VoxEdit. Okay, so let's get started. To start with, we're going to set up our reference scene using the medium human template. This particular asset we're not going to make any edits to, and we're not going to turn it into a version of the medium human. We're going to create our own from scratch. Something to be aware of, that the version that you will be creating along with this video will not be compatible with the animations in the medium human template, so you would have to create brand new animations. Okay, so to start with, we'll put them into T-stance. I'm going to click down here in the animation list and press T. I can minimize the timeline now. Next up, we've got to make sure all of the nodes are set to anchor in the inspector. So to check that out, we're going to go over here in the inspector, and this is the anchor setting. All the nodes are set to this. I've already done this. So you see as I click the nodes, this button stays blue. In the latest version of VoxEdit, if you press Ctrl and A to select all nodes, and you change the setting in the inspector, it'll actually affect all of the selected nodes. So now I'll just check a few, and you'll see that the anchor setting is off. Okay, so I'm going to turn that on again. What the anchor setting does is when we start creating IK chains and turn on the IK solver, any nodes that are tagged as anchor are not influenced by the IK solver, so they don't move as the other IK chains. The only IK chains that we're going to have in this will be the left and right arms and the left and right legs. The rest of the body will be set to anchor nodes. Now I'll start building the right leg IK chain. We're going to do that by going through each of the important parts. First thing is we need to just create a hip node. Then we're going to create what is called the IK setup joints, then the IK chain, and then finally the effector. So there's 3 parts to any IK setup in VoxEdit. To begin that, I'm going to first minimize the nodes in the skeleton tree. I'm going to hold Shift and click the minus button. What that does is that collapses not only the node that you clicked on, but all of the child nodes, like so. So you'll see it's all very neat. So you can also hold Shift and click the plus, and what that does is that expands all the nodes underneath that one. So even if they were collapsed before, it will expand that one also. So I'm going to close that, collapse that, so it's nice and neat. And I'm going to start off by creating a hip node. So this is the starting node. We need something to connect the IK chain to. Mostly in a human you have the hips and say the shoulders, something like that. In a horse you would have the hips and then also the shoulders, which would be in a more horizontal plane, that kind of thing. So we need a starting point. So let's go to create child node, new hips. Great. I'm going to go to the front view, which I'm going to use the view cube here. And you'll see I'm in perspective mode because what I want to do is I first want to line up the hips with the medium human hips. But because we're in perspective mode, it's not so easy to get it accurate. So I'm going to use this button down here to go to orthographic view. So click that once. Nice and neat then. And there we go. So this is roughly right. I'm not going to get it exactly perfect. You'll see the medium human is slightly off center. His skeleton is slightly off center in this particular T-pose. That's fine because we're only using it for reference for ourselves. Okay, let's go back to perspective mode. And let's move those hips forward. So we're going to build our guy in front of this one. Okay, so that's our sort of beginning point. Now we get into the actual setup of the IK chain. So the 3 areas of an IK chain, as I mentioned, of creating IK in VoxEdit, is you need the IK setup joints Then you need the IK chain itself, which would be the arm or the leg in our case. And then you need the effector, which is the part that you move around in the scene that makes the arm or leg bend in a natural way. So let's start with the setup nodes. So we have our hips. There's nothing in the viewport here to see just because we don't see a node until it has a length. Then you get this shape here. So we're going to first create what's called a facing node. So I'm going to create a child node of the new hips. I'm going to call it right leg underscore facing. So it's our facing node. What's important to IK in VoxEdit is the axis that the node is facing along. In our case, it should always be the y-axis. So we're going to leave the hips alone, but the facing node we're going to use to tell VoxEdit which direction the IK chain is within the scene. In our case, it's over here to the right. So I'm going to rotate the y-axis so that it faces off towards the right leg. So I'm going to press 3. I'm going to rotate a bit. And I'm just going to check my axis over here. I want it to be accurate, so I'm going to go -90, which corrects itself to being 270. You can also type 270. And I'm going to press 2 to see my move tool, so I can see that the y-axis is indeed facing in the right direction. Let's go to front view. So you can see it's facing off towards where the right leg is. That is all you need for this particular part of the node setup. Next, we need a child node under this one. So I'm going to hold Control Shift and N. That's the shortcut for creating a new node in the skeleton panel. And I'm going to call this one right leg underscore IK. This is where the IK effectively will begin in the chain. This is still a setup node. So I'm going to make sure I click the right leg IK. And what this node is for is setting the distance basically away from our starting point, in our case the hips, to where the leg is. I can pull this node out. So our facing node is still only rotated, it has no length, but now the IK node has got a length. I'm going to go again to orthographic view and front using the view cube. And what you'll see is the length of the node, I'm going to line it up with the hip of the right leg. And then you'll notice I've gone straight out, I haven't rotated down. If you do want to have an orientation or a rotation on this setup node, you have to do it from the facing, don't do it from this one. Never do this. Because what's happening here is now I've added translation to my x-axis as well as my y. We only want it on the y. The way we do that, if we want to have a rotation on this, go back to the facing joint and then just tweak the axis of the facing joint. The y-axis is still facing towards where the right leg will be, but now it's at a slight angle. So that's how we get our rotation. You'll also notice that while we're in this axis orientation up here, which is object axis orientation or local axis mode, the y-axis is actually angled correctly. So as I do this, you'll see only the y-axis here is changing its value. Now for this particular demo, I'm going to leave my version with the hips straight out. That's just my choice. So we have our facing node, then we have our IK node, which has a length, moves only in the y-axis. The second part of the IK node is we have to now make it face where the IK chain will be. So I'm going to press 3. Our IK chain will be facing downwards because it's a leg. So we're going to point towards where the foot will be. I'm going to rotate it roughly 90 degrees. I'm going to check over here again, -90, or I can type 270. Have a look. Yeah, that looks good. So I'm going to go back to perspective mode. So now we can start creating our IK chain. The IK chain will be a child of the IK setup node. So let's create a child node again. Call it right thigh. Okay, so that's our right thigh. We're actually going to make no change to that. You'll see over here, if I click on the right thigh, it has no values at all in the inspector. That's good. It allows us always to get back to our starting point because we can just use the reset button to turn all these back to 0. So we actually make no changes to the right thigh. To give the right thigh length down towards the knee, we're actually going to now create the knee joint and then put that in place. So create another child node, right underscore knee, and let's just call it IK. And now making sure I choose the correct node, I'm going to pull this down to where the knee is. Again, orthographic view, front view, just to help with alignment. We're going to do a lot of testing with this, by the way. So for now, these setups are just to get everything in place, but as soon as we start testing, we will make tweaks to this if necessary. And now we're going to add the foot. So create child node, right foot. Okay. I'm going to select a foot node and drag that down. And once again, orthographic, front, and we are good to go. Okay, so it's good enough. It's not exactly right. If we do want, for example, the leg to come out a little more, we can go back out here to the right IK leg. If I did want to change this, you'll notice that it's moved the y-axis to the x. Just for my own sanity, I like to rotate this back out. Fix my y length. Make sure I'm in object mode. Sometimes if your X, Y, or Z do not look correct, you should check that you're in object orientation mode, because the world mode shows you the axis as it is in the world. Parent mode shows you the axis as to whatever the parent would be, in this case it would be the facing. And object mode is the orientation of the actual node itself. So if I wanted to change the length, I'd go like so, I'd find a nice length, and then I would rotate it down back to the way we were. So make it 270. Great. Go back to perspective. So now what we have is we have our two setup nodes, which are these guys, and we have our IK chain. And the last thing we need is our effector. So you collect the end, the last node in the IK chain, which in our case is the foot, so basically the bottom. We're going to click the drop node under effector. So we can either drop a node here, or we can create one by pressing plus. And you'll see in the skeleton panel, this new node has been created under the world node. This needs to stay under the world node just for it to work. And it also becomes selected. Now if I move this, nothing will happen. And if I turn on IK, it'll sort of look like it kind of want to work, but it's not quite right. Okay, so to make this work, what we haven't done is we haven't set the new hip to anchor. So I'm going to press undo, I'm going to bring it back. So remember what I mentioned before is that only the IK chain, which is these three nodes here, the thigh, the knee, and the foot, do not use the anchor. Everything else should use the anchor, including the setup nodes. So I'm going to click the hips, turn on anchor. I'm going to choose the right leg facing, turn on anchor, and the leg IK. The starting point, which is the hips, the setup nodes, which is the facing and the IK, are set to anchor, and these three nodes are not. Also, the effector does not need to be set to anchor. All right, so now let's turn back on IK. It looks like it's on here, but that's just a slight bug. So I'm going to turn it on again. You'll notice nothing has really changed like it did before. And now when I move the leg around, it seems to be doing a little bit what I expect. The knee is maybe facing a bit too strongly in different directions, but we're going to deal with that. So to help ourselves visualize this a little better, we're going to put some models on these nodes. So let's make a copy of the right leg and put it onto our IK chain. So right leg, right thigh, and right foot. So I've selected these three by holding Control and clicking. I'm going to press Control and D to duplicate. I'm going to call it right leg new, and then we'll just leave it at that. I think that'll name each of them right leg new 1, 2, 3. This is the thigh, so I'm going to drag this onto the right thigh IK. This is the leg, so the lower leg, so I'm going to drag this onto the knee, and then we have our new foot. I'm going to drag this on here. So you can see that because of the orientation that I have used, these are not aligned correctly. Also, you'll notice that they're at slightly funny angles. We'll solve that in a second, but first off, let's solve the facing so it looks correct. So I'm going to double click this model here, and right now we're in our normal modeling camera mode. I'm going to go to global mode. This is the rigger camera mode. If you turn on this button down here, your camera matches the kind of camera movement you will see in the animator. The only thing to be aware of is this works really great. You can color and edit your models in this mode. Okay, so while in the rigger camera mode, we're going to flip this. It looks to me like I only need to flip it probably in the y-axis, which is the vertical axis here. So I'm going to click this. Okay, that looks like a good start. Come out of the modeler. So I'm going to try and double click it here in the viewport. There we go. So now this is easier to visualize. Again, I'm going to flip it in the y. I flipped it in the y-axis. And then finally we'll do the foot, and again flip it in the y-axis. So as I mentioned, these are slightly twisted. So what I'm going to do is select all three nodes by holding Control, clicking each. I'm going to go back here to the inspector, and I'm going to click the Reset Rotations button. There we go. It also looks like the thigh probably wants to be flipped across the x-axis. That might be for all of them, but just to make sure that this thigh and this thigh look the same, I'm only going to rotate the thigh alone and leave the lower leg. I could always solve it later. Yeah, they don't. You can see they don't line up on the side. The lower leg, that's just my doing, so why not? Let's do it correctly. It's probably because there's some placement in the nodes. You'll notice that when I placed my nodes, I did not translate them left or right. So when I drag down the knee, to here. You'll notice I only dragged in the y-axis. I didn't do anything like this. That's how you could help align this, but that will affect your IK chain. So it's better to only keep the length of a node in the y-axis, the facing axis of each of the IK nodes. All right, so here we are again. So leg is set up. We can have a look at the skeleton. Okay, looks fine. I'm going to turn on the IK, and you'll see the twist happens. And if I turn off the skeleton up here and then move the IK, you can see it's doing something, but it's not very predictable. We need a certain amount of predictability with this. So that's where we get into the constraints. So let's undo this. Again, if I wanted to stop here, by the way, and turn off IK, I can still clean this up by selecting the 3 IK chain nodes, hitting reset. And the reason that works is because when I built these, the rotations were all left alone. There was no change to rotation, so it's very easy to get your IK set up back to default position. So let's see if we can control some of the orientation of these nodes. To set up the constraints in the inspector, we actually have to be in IK mode. As you can see again, we have the leg automatically sort of twists into an odd position. This won't happen the moment you create your first constraint. So the first thing we want to do really is to, I'm just going to undo this, is to work out what the constraints can do. So our constraints, just to help you understand, they're going to help us work out the twist, the swing, the sway of the joints. So that would be the thigh. The thigh's got a pretty decent range of motion, being a ball and socket joint, and then the hinge joint, which is the lower leg, we only need to have this range of motion. At present, as you saw, we can't really leave the constraints as they are because the leg kind of twists and breaks all over the place and it's very unpredictable. So let's use the constraints to improve that. All right, so I'm just going to undo again, back to starting position. So the first thing I want to do is I want to press this plus button here with the thigh selected to get my first constraint. You'll notice the lower leg's updated. Now, this is all set to default, but once you've created your first constraint, then the leg sort of locks in place in a nice way. You can see it's sort of facing forward. We are in IK mode. So really, it would twist out before now, but as soon as I press plus, it put all of these into effect, including the roll. Even though the roll was visible before, like so, on the lower leg, it's not actually in effect yet. So what the roll is, to start with, is the twist of the leg, like this. Okay, so we're going to set that up first. To visualize it, we have to turn on IK. This little I button here lets you see the constraint itself, which is shown as a red sphere, and there's this little green line. That is our roll. To see the little green line or how it works better, I'm just going to change this range to 359. So not 360 degrees. The reason for that is when it's set to 360, it just assumes that the leg can spin the whole way around like this. And we don't want that. We kind of want the leg to only be able to spin, to twist this much. So the range I'm going to set to 180 degrees, which is half. So 180 degrees, and you'll see what happens to that arc or that circle. It becomes half. So this is our starting point. The range goes around here, 180 degrees, and before it was like 359, 360, which meant it came all the way around here. So if I make this now 90 degrees, the range will only go to here, halfway. And this is 180. So let's make the range 90 degrees. Okay, so it's doing what we want it to do, but right now, this is the range of the twist. What that means is this leg can only twist like this, from here to here. We don't want that. We want it to be facing forward and to twist here to here. So that means we have to offset or set up a start point. So this is our start point. Our start point is set to 0 degrees. If I make it 45 degrees, it's going to move the start point over here and our range will follow. So let's make it 45 so you can see. So it moved from here, which is facing forwards, which was 0, to 45 degrees here. So we kind of want to go minus 45 degrees. What that'll mean is this 90 degree range will be 45 degrees on this side and 45 degrees on that side. So we need our center point to be minus 45. Now unfortunately in this field, if I type in minus 45, I get nothing. I actually have to type in 315, which is 360 degrees minus 45. And you can see it lines up. So what's happened is my start position, which was at 0, which is here, went all the way around and then stopped at 315 degrees, which is here. And now that gives me 45 degrees to the start point, 45 degrees to the inner range. So outer range, inner range as it were. So again, now my range of twist is this. That seems like pretty much what the human leg probably can do on average. We want to sort of manage some of this. We won't get all the range we want always, but we'll get as close as we can. So that's our twist. Be aware that the range length determines the default starting position, which is this thin gray line here. Great, so that's our twist. Now we want to have the rest of our range of motion. So let's move the effector and see what that is at the moment. If you notice, the thigh can only go this far back and this far forward. So you look at the thigh's not doing very much. And that's because I need to visualize here, so I'm going to turn off IK, turn it on. This is our range of motion. So when we click the plus button, we got this default. If I increase the radius, say to, let's say 45 degrees, this is the radius, as it were, of the range of motion. Let's see what that gives us now when we move the effector. So you'll see that the boundaries or the borders of the green circle sets our limit of the range of motion. So you'd have to ask yourself, is this enough for the thigh? Now I've got some numbers written down here just from trial and error, and I trial and error by doing what you just saw me do there. I will go, oh, do I kind of want this to go further? Because like if he squats down, should his leg be able to go like 90 degrees out or even higher? So depending on the hips, that will always change, but we need, I think, a bigger range of motion. So maybe I would change the radius from 45 to 60. And the nice thing is, if you have the effector far enough away and the leg is stuck, then you'll see it update live. So again, let's increase it again, maybe 120. Oh, wrong one. 120 on the radius. You can see like it's quite a big green area. That's our range of motion there. It's pretty huge now. Maybe too much. Because the guy can do pretty much anything he wants with his thigh. We kind of don't want to go that far maybe. So let's use the numbers I've written down. I have 0 for the yaw, 0 for the pitch, and I have 80 for the radius. So let's press 80 here. There we go. Move the effector. Great. Okay, so you can see the thigh sort of does what I want. It doesn't twist too much. Has a pretty decent range of motion. Maybe it's too much, but you know, it's up to the user to kind of define some elements. We can only help so far. All right, so next thing is we need to work out what the yaw and the pitch is. We're going to use the lower leg to help describe what these are. So again, you notice the lower leg twists when IK is on, like so. It's twisted out, but the moment I create my first constraint, it sort of lines up the leg back to what might be close to default. I'm going to just turn off IK and zero these out. Click reset, turn on my IK. Yeah, the lower leg does okay, but there is a small change in the bend here. That's fine. So let's work out what the yaw and twist is. So click the lower leg. I already created this constraint. Leave the range for a moment, because we only want to work out what these guys do first. So let's increase the radius. We already know that's the range of motion for this particular constraint. Now if I click plus again, I can get more constraints. But let's work out what the yaw and the pitch is. So the yaw and the pitch is either one of the axes to twist in, and that could be the Z or the X. The Y is our roll effectively, because of the way I've set up my Y-axis to look along the node, or along the joint. But we need the X and the Z axis. So the yaw, I'm going to make minus 45 degrees and see which direction it goes in. So it's gone backwards. It's a little hard to visualize here right now because it's updating based on the lower leg, upper leg. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the thigh then to visualize this. I'm going to make this 20, because this won't move then if I use the thigh. Once I've done with this, I will return it back to normal. So let's see what the yaw does. So minus 20, it starts to go back. So where does it go when it goes minus 45? Okay, so the yaw seems to be this way around, so from front to back. If I go to 90 degrees, it should come out here on the front of the sphere. Yeah, so our yaw is the swing front and back, like kicking a football. That should mean the pitch is from left to right. So let's see if like minus or positive brings this little circle towards the camera now, basically towards this side of the sphere. So let's make it minus 45, so it goes away, which means 45 comes towards us. So the pitch is the side-to-side motion, like swinging your leg in and out. So that's what the yaw on the pitch is. So let's put that into effect. I'm going to return it back to 0 and increase the radius back to 80. So we have a nice big range of motion for the thigh. We have our twist already, so now let's go to lower leg. So we have our first point. Now, as we create more of these, we connect them. So let's create a second one. And right now you can't see it because they're right on top of each other. So I'm going to give it a radius of 20. So that's, if I would give it a radius of 30, you'll see that it looks like the circle's grown, but only one of the two circles has grown. The other one is still a bit smaller inside. Makes no difference when you have multiple of these green range of motions on top of each other, because it's only this green range of motion that matters in total. So let's return it to 20. Now we want to move one of the green circles to the back, because we want the leg to be able to bend basically all the way back, quite far actually, to something like this. But we also don't want it to twist out this way or bend out this way. And at the moment, if I go to the IK and I do this, because, well, actually we have a very small range of motion, so let's just increase that to 80, like the thigh. If we left it the same as the thigh, then the effect we would get would be this. The leg would look like it's broken, and it also can't bend far enough back to what a human leg can do. So again, just for visualization, and let's change this back to 20. And I'm going to move one of the circles back. So I'm going to move the lower circle back. And if you remember, yaw is to swing back and forth, is to place the green circle on either the back of the sphere or the front. So we're going to move it to the back and make that minus 90 degrees. And you'll see what happens is it's basically drawing a channel, a green channel between them. So it tries to connect them. And so now we have a channel or a range of motion for the lower leg. So let's go to the effector. Go forward. You can see I can't go much forward than that. I still get a bit of a double jointed movement there, but we'll solve that in a second. And I can bend the leg back, but not quite far enough. So I want to go further. So let's undo that. Select the leg again here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to first make the radius smaller, because the leg can actually also twist out and swing out and in a little bit. So I want it to be pretty tight. So I'm going to make it 10 degrees. And 10 degrees, and what that's done is it's made the channel thinner. Not so much movement from side to side is now possible. We also want to move this second point further back up here. So I want the channel to go higher so I can bend further. So make it minus 120. So there's my range of motion. So now again, click the effector and move the leg back. See what happens. That looks pretty good. Okay, and you can tweak that to your liking. The other thing is I'm still getting a bit of a double jointed look here. This might cause trouble at some points if the leg gets locked when I'm trying to make a pose. So what I can do with that is I can just move this starting point back a little bit. So let's make it minus 5 degrees. What that does is it just moves it back a little bit. We didn't see it happen there because we weren't in default position. So let's see if we get a nicer movement here. So you should just see this little green bar move back. Minus 5. Yeah, there you go. So that should just stop the locking of the knee in a sort of double jointed way. So now we can make him walk. We should be able to make him sway his leg out and in without too many any odd twists, because we still have our like twist here. You can see even when I go up here, even though the leg is, this is our twist, even though it's visualized here from the starting position, it is following the axis of the leg. You can also see we have a little bit of a bend outwards in the leg here, and that's because of our range, because we do have a little bit of a thickness on the green channel. So we could make it smaller again, like make it 1 degree or 2 degrees, but I like to have a little bit of movement there myself. Okay, so now we've pretty much set up our constraints for our thigh, which has a nice big range, which is really controlled mostly by the twist. The twist stops it from like going crazy all around here. And in the lower leg, we have a nice channel for the bend. So the foot is the next thing. So with the IK on, let's move the hips just to show you how the IK can also be handy. So we can click the effector, move the foot around. But one of the joys of IK is you now have feet that can be planted on the floor. So as I move the hips down, you notice the ankle doesn't move. But in our case, the foot does rotate. We need to stop that rotation. We need the foot to feel like it's really just staying flat on the floor unless I decide to twist or bend it. So what we're going to do is we're going to add what's called an FK foot onto the end of this. FK foot is in forward kinematics. So I'm going to reset the chain back to 0. I'm going to make a duplicate of the foot node. And I'm going to call this one right foot FK. Now what this does is this will override the IK foot. We literally don't need the IK foot anymore. We're going to use it only for the effector. So nothing else has changed that we've created so far. We're just going to add this onto the end. So I'm going to rename this node and I'm going to call it ankle. Great. So once you've anchored it, it now becomes basically an FK node, which effectively means I can now rotate the foot and twist it, but you can't see it at the moment because there's no model on it. The model is still on the ankle. So let's put the same model that's on the ankle on the foot. Let's sit down here, drag it onto the foot, which actually means we don't need the model on the ankle anymore because we have it now down here. So if we just hold shift and delete. So what we've done is remove the foot from our original ankle, which is when it used to twist around. We've now added an FK foot, which means I can just go in and I can rotate it manually, and the IK chain doesn't affect it. And the reason I have that is because I turned on anchor. But what's great about this is now when I move the hips, that foot will still try to follow the IK chain, as in up and down, left and right, but it won't follow the rotations. So there you go. So that's where the effector is. The reason it slides up a little bit is because the effector is just a little below it. But if I move it down, as soon as the ankle gets to the effector, you notice the foot looks like it's planted. And then if I want, for example, the foot to be like bent outwards so it's a more natural position, I can do that, but I have to do it manually like so. Yeah. So it's good to know that you can still have full control over the foot. So if you're making the character run or walk, just move the hips back up, click the effector, make the foot go back, and I think, oh, okay, now I need to make the foot rotate. I would only put my rotations then on the FK foot. And then if I make the foot go forward, so I want him to run, and I go, okay, now I need to make the foot twist forward, then I click the foot and I place it. And now I can have my poses for a run using the IK chain, as well as using the foot, the FK foot. And I can also, again, move the hips and the foot will sort of stay in place. Remember, as I mentioned before, as soon as you force your IK chain beyond the constraints that we've set up, that's when this happens and the foot moves away like so. And that's because the foot is like kind of being limited in how close it can get to the effector because of the constraints we put on the rest of the joints. But as soon as we get within this range here, it's pretty good. It does exactly what it says. So let's put them all back to the beginning. Let's set this up so that it's nice and neat again. So we're going to put the hips back in place about there. What I'm going to do here actually is I want to turn off the IK. I'm going to recreate the effector just so you can see that you can do that as often as you want, but please be aware that if you've got any animation on the effector, so you've been working on animation for a while, by deleting the effector and then recreating it, you're going to lose that animation on that effector. So just be aware. But just so you know, say for example you need to reset everything up and you select these, turn off your IK, you reset back to 0, and maybe your IK is in an odd position and you're not sure how to get it back over here. Sometimes you might, particularly while testing and setting up your rig, you might just delete the effector, click on the ankle. We have the wrong model on the foot there for the ankle, but we'll fix that in a second. Click on the ankle, click the plus button over here, and now we've got our effector back for that leg. Shift delete to remove the model. I'm going to shift delete, remove the model from that. Clearly I just did one too many undos. There we go. So now our leg is fully set up. We can turn on IK. You can see nothing happens. It doesn't go pop, it doesn't go break. We can move the hips. We can move the effector. And we can rotate the foot, move the foot. So let's make sure we are set to anchor. No, we're not. There we go. Great. To create the left leg, we're going to use the right leg IK chain. Rather than rebuild it, we're just going to make a duplicate. We don't need to duplicate the hips, but we are going to duplicate the IK setup. So that means we are simply going to make a duplicate of the right leg facing, which will give us a copy of everything else. So I'm going to click on the right leg facing, Control and D to make a duplicate. I'm going to call it left leg facing. And now both IK chains are on top of each other, but I want to move the left leg over to the other side. One option would be to rotate around the Z-axis using the facing and then using the IK to get the direction of the leg. So we're going to tell it the direction of the leg even though we have it like so. So the question always becomes here is, are all my rotations correct? You'll notice that the thigh is facing the wrong way, as in we have this little notch on the inside of the thigh here, which is on the outside of that thigh. That can be solved by flipping the model, or making a duplicate of the model and then flipping it. The question though becomes is, would I need to reset up all of my constraints? Because sometimes you'll find that the constraints that you've set up in a joint are specific to that facing. So to where the y-axis, where the z-axis or where the x-axis are relative to each other. In this case, we kept everything pretty much even down the center. Okay, so everything should be set up just the same. It's all pretty good. We can rename everything in a second. But just be aware that the right ankle, or left ankle, let's rename this one, is actually currently using the effector for the other leg. And what that means is when I turn on the IK, you'll see that that foot tries to touch the effector, which is down here. Let's turn off the skeleton. So the left leg is trying to look over here. He wants to be friends with that effector, which means I can move one effector and basically both legs will move. We don't want that. We want each leg to have its own effector, like so. So let's fix that. First off, I can just click the X button on the left leg, make sure I'm on the left ankle, click X, then click plus. And now I have two effectors. I've got the right ankle effector and the left ankle effector. Now when I turn on the IK, you can see neither leg moves. I can click the effector for the left leg, move it around. So now I can put one foot there and the other foot here. And because it's we've just copied the setup, I get all of the correct anchor naming and so on, so that the feet line up correctly. So the only thing might be there's too much range here in the sway. So this is something that you would probably want to play with and test out. So this is the left leg ankle. Let's see what happens to the knee. Yeah, looks okay. So by moving around a bit, it kind of fixes itself a little bit. But you may want to tweak these until you get them to a point where you want them. But because we use constraints here, it's not as precise as, for example, a pole vector, which lets you sort of separately affect the facing of the knee, so you can be more precise. But this is still pretty good. Let's bring the feet back. So effectively, we've done the left leg now. That was nice and easy. Next up, we're just going to create the upper body, the torso. So we're going to go to, again, orthographic view, front view, and I'm going to go to the hips, the new hips, new underscore belly, and under that we will call that new underscore chest, and underscore under that we will create new underscore head. And let's put those all in place. So first the belly up to roughly here, yeah, in line there. Then we go up to the chest, which is about here. There we go. And then up to the head. And remember again, we don't want these to be affected by the IK, so let's select all three and turn on the anchor. Okay, so those are now nicely set up. Next thing we need to do is we need to deal with the setup nodes, the facing and the IK. So if we follow the same layout as our medium human, we're going to start the facing here, basically at the chest node. So we go to the chest, we create our first facing node. So again, we're going back to following the same rules again. So create a child node, and we'll call it right arm facing. Remember, there's no movement on this node. It's only about getting the y-axis to look towards here. So I'm going to press 3. We can move the arm facing, move it this way, press 2. Yeah, there we go. There's our y-axis. Sometimes you just have to tweak it. You might want a nice round number on here, like 320, just so you can write it down maybe and stay accurate, but it looked like 322 was fine. And next up we need our IK node. So we have our facing node, that's all it needed to do. We'll just check to see the y-axis is facing along. You remember I mentioned before about the z-axis? I wanted the z-axis to be facing in the correct direction for the elbow. In this case it would be backwards, but I'm going to wait till I get up here and then maybe I'll try and do it here. So I'm going to create a child node of this one, which will be our IK. So right arm underscore IK. And this node has got a length like so up until the shoulder, and we can tweak our facing node if we think it's off. So I selected the wrong one, so let's go again. There we go, that's where the arm roughly is. Go back to the facing node and just tweak the rotation till it's about on top of the original. Yep, our reference guy. Great. And let's just check. Yep, so our y-axis is facing along this node. And the next thing to do with the IK node is to make the y-axis face where the chain is going to be. In this case, it's off here to the side. So press 2 to see. Yep, it looks pretty good. Great. So now we can create our IK chain. So as I mentioned before, I can change the z-axis facing. I'm going to try that now. I'm going to go back to perspective mode. So I mentioned before that the z-axis sort of determines the rotation at the beginning of where the twist will be, which is our roll here. So 0 will always be facing the z-axis. Normally I would do this on the facing, but just to see if we can do it in the setup nodes this way around, I'm going to move it so that the z-axis, which is facing forward, moves to the back. So we rotate around the y-axis. So we're not changing the y-axis, we're just we're changing the facing of the z-axis. So if I press 2 now, the z-axis is facing back with basically the elbow, which means that's where our twist should begin. And our y-axis is still facing out along the arm. So great. We have our 2 setup nodes for the arm. Now for the actual IK chain, again, orthographic, front view, just for ease of alignment, and a child node of the IK. So create a child node, call it right shoulder IK. And if you remember, this one gets no length. We make no change to this particular node. So click it, you'll notice it's got 0 rotations and 0 translations. That's perfect. It's easy for cleaning up your scene. Child, let's create a child node of that. So right underscore elbow IK. And then that one does have a length that goes out to where the elbow should be. That basically gives the length to the shoulder. And then let's go for the wrist. So create a child node, right underscore wrist IK. And we make sure it's selected here and we drag. Great. Okay, so that's our arm now set up with our setup nodes and our IK chain. And remember, the setup nodes need to be set to anchor because we don't want those to be moving around with the IK. Let's check that everything else is. The head is, yeah, great. And then we can go to the wrist and we'll just create an effector for the wrist. So select the wrist, turn it on. Now let's turn on our IK and see what happens. Turn off our skeleton here and let's see if it's easier to visualize this way. So we can see we have these joints here for the right arm. And we can, let's pull it in and out so we can see the elbow twist. There we go. And of course the elbow will twist the wrong way on us as well, just because we haven't set up our constraints. So let's set up our constraints very quickly. So now we have some models to help visualize. Let's see, maybe the thigh and the hips or the belly and the hips and stuff will also be usable now. So where's the belly? There it is. Drop the belly there. Where's the hips? The hip model's here. Drop it on the new hip. And chest. Let's drop that on the chest. That's the belly I dropped on the chest. There we go. And let's drop the head on the head node. Yeah, we're looking pretty good. Yeah. And so again, remember what I mentioned before, that they may not line up exactly like this guy because chances are there was some translation put in here to line up, but we can't have that with the IK chain. Otherwise everything, basically the IK chain will reset those translations. If you move it back here like so, and you start turning on your IK chain, it'll pop back out of alignment. So it's best to just make sure, what I would do is I would go in here, since it's a duplicate model, I can turn on like my pivot tool and I would just, move it until it's about right. This is the new version of the pivot tool. You can still use the old version by going down here and turning on modeler mode, which the difference is it moves the scene so that you can line up the model. But when you're in rigger mode, you're moving the model around like you would normally in the animator mode, but might take a little bit of getting used to. So I'm just going to line this up a little bit forward here until it lines up with the elbow, and then I can come back out and we are good to go. Excellent. So now we have to set up some constraints for the arm. I think at this point we probably could delete this guy because we have everything we need. So I'm going to select the controller. Another option would be to delete all his models. You can't hide them, unfortunately, like just by putting them in a group or something. But what I could do is, for example, I could Shift A select. If you hold Shift A and then click on the controller, it'll select that node plus all of its children. You notice it's not selecting the new IK guy. Then I can hold Shift and delete and just remove all the models from that IK, or from that skeleton, like so. But I can also just delete them. So let's delete them. Okay, so here's our IK guy, looking good. Turn on the IK. The arm still gets a bit messy. The feet stay in place. So let's fix that arm. So I'm going to undo. And like you saw before, we can skip being overly descriptive about the details of the inspector. We've done all that before. So for the right arm, the upper arm, we're going to create just one constraint. And then we're going to set the roll to being 320 degrees and -120. Let's see what that gives us. Sorry, plus 120. So what this effectively is this is the twist of the elbow. So the elbow can twist up this high and down that high. So effectively what it's saying is, if my arm is bent right now, let's just click on the wrist, bend in the arm. Unfortunately, our range of motion is also turned on, so let's just give it a larger range of motion. And now bring in the elbow. We've got to bring it forward as well to force the twist. We will be solving the lower arm as well, so it can't do this. So our twist is that our elbow can go up this high and back, but it can't go too far. And again, this will need to be checked and just played around with until you've reached sort of found the limits of it. But until we set up our constraints here, it's just going to look a little odd for a moment. So let's just reset these three. 1, 2, 3. Got to turn off IK to reset them. Let's see where our wrist effector is. Our wrist effector is not exactly in the right place, so we're just going to delete him and recreate him. It's not a big problem. Wrist IK. Make a new one. Delete the model, because I don't need the model. On the IK, Shift Delete. And let's check our settings. I might have undone too much there. I did. So 320 starting point and 120, which gives us this kind of twist here for the upper arm. And then for the range of motion, we'll give it 90. So we're going to leave the pitch and the yaw alone. And we're going to give it a full range of motion for that ball and socket joint. Again, going to need a lot of tweaking for your own preferences, but this should get us a pretty good movement for the upper arm. Now for the elbow, we want something the same as what we did for the knee. So effectively we want a hinge joint. So for that we want, again, a very small twist here. And because we've made the z-axis face backwards, that should be our starting point. If I type in 359 here, our little break here is where it should start. So that's good. At least we know the z-axis gives us what we want, even if we change it in the second setup node. You can, as I said, you can also change it in the first setup node. But the z-axis determines the starting point, the starting direction for the roll. Okay, so for this, we're going to make it 350 and 20. So the starting point is 350, which is basically -10 degrees, and 20. So we're giving it the same kind of range as the knee. The reason it is up at a funny angle is because over here, this halfway point is where it thinks its starting should be. So we can actually bring this down by changing its starting position. So if it's 120, let's see, so 120, 60 degrees each way, so this should be 300, which is basically 360 minus 60. And that brings us back to 300, and now it's aligned nicely. This might not be the range we want though, because of the elbow, we might not want to twist in so much, but let's just make it nice and even for now. And we need now our channel for the bend. And our channel for the bend, we need, we're going to create two like we did before. Two constraints, one for the green dot here, one for the green dot in the front. So our yaw most likely is still the swinging forward and back. And let's see if 120, which is the same as what we did for the leg. So it goes to the back, so let's make it -120 so it swings forward, because we want the elbow to be able to bend forward. Nod, and let's make it just 10, like a very small radius, 10 degrees. And let's make the yaw for the beginning position, which is down here, we would normally, like you saw before, we made it 5 degrees, so because we're going the opposite way, -5. So we could also make it -10 just to really protect ourselves, and turn off the IK and turn it on. And now let's see what happens when we move that wrist effector. So now we get a nice bend in the arm. I will say that if you are setting up an IK for a character, generally we don't put IK in the arms. If you have an IK FK switch, which means you can use FK for most of your character animations and then just IK whenever you want to. For example, put the hands on a table and have the body move around. That'll sort of act like the hips with the feet. So if you pretend that these are the hands on a table and this is the chest, as I would move the chest, the hands will stay on the table. So that's why that can be useful. As you can see now, because the arm has got IK, we generally wouldn't do this, but some people like to animate with IK arms, and that is fine, of course. Okay, so if you're not aware of animation, then a little bit of testing will sort of give you an idea of what that all means. So select the hips, yay. So everything seems to be doing what it wants. So again, we want that control over the wrist, if you remember we did last time. So what we're going to do is create a new node and anchor it. So create a child node, right hand FK. This is the forward kinematic hand. I'm going to put the hand on that node. So right hand new, this guy. I'm going to remove the model from the wrist. So now we're going to anchor this, and let's turn back off and on the IK. And now when we move the wrist, the hand doesn't move unless I click the hand model or the node and then just place it like so. So we don't get that sort of free rotation, which is definitely a problem in the foot, but may not be as much of a problem for you in the hand, because you kind of want the wrist to sort of follow the rotation of the hand, to follow the rotation of the wrist as often as possible. So to do the other arm, I'm going to select facing for the right arm, Control and D to duplicate, and call it left arm facing. And I think what I'll do is I'll follow the rule I made for the last version, where I used the Z-axis. I basically made it go over the top, as it were, to make the duplicate. Let's see, turn on the skeleton a little more, and then I'll just look at what number looks about good. I guess 38 would be probably right. And then click the FK arm, the FK chain, rotate that down here. There we go. And the models would then need their flipping again. I think in most cases they're fine. Okay, so now we can, and remember that the wrist of the new left arm is probably still anchored to the wrist of the right arm, which means that arm will try and grab over here. I'll turn on the IK to show you that in action. So this arm will try to go over, face over that side. And now if I move the IK for the wrist around, so we'll give it its own IK effector in a moment. You see the other arm's trying to, the left arm's trying to reach, but of course we've turned on some constraints, which is why it's sort of dabbing, I guess you could say at the moment. There you go. I don't think that's very good dabbing, but let's give it a left wrist controller now. So we select the left wrist. Right now it's called right wrist 1, but we'll best if we rename it first, because the effector takes its name from the node. So call it left, and then with that selected, I'm going to remove the right and add the left. And now we have 2 effectors here for the wrists, 2 for the feet. And now if I turn it on, there we go. Oh, it also looks like I might have done something. The model is duplicated, which is why not duplicated, which is why this wrist is facing the wrong way. So let's see if we can't duplicate this one. We'll just leave the name as it is and make that go here, and then we'll flip it across the x-axis again. Turn on the IK, you can see nothing goes pop. I will say that it's important not to make a controller for this now. I tend to make a controller at the end, and the reason being is if I turn off the IK and I put all of this is our new guy here, our IK version. If I put him under a controller, so create child node controller, which is quite normal, but this you can do before exporting, and then turn on IK, you can see he moves, and that's because it tries to force the starting position down here, and then it puts the first node directly above it at the same distance. And in our case, that basically meant that the hips were here, and it rotated them up so it's vertical, and then moved it back. So, but when you finish your animation, you just turn off IK. You can then parent it to the controller and then move it in place. But we don't want that now anyway. So I'm going to delete the controller. But generally, I should now be able to move the hips and get an expected result. Occasionally, you'll see the feet sort of go under the ground like so. Something to be aware in VoxEdit that's different from other softwares is that the IK is not always on. What that means is, if I, for example, make a nice pose like this, and I go down and I get my effector, let's see, we're going to solve the effectors in a moment for easy selection. So I do this, and I think to myself, oh, I want to tweak the leg a little bit. You can do that by turning off the IK, and then maybe you want to come in and just tweak that leg a little. Let's turn on our auto slurp so we get a, there we go. Yeah, like so. Maybe you want to tweak the foot, that's fine. But just so you're aware, the moment you turn on IK on this particular keyframe, it will force the pose back onto the IK effector. So watch the foot. Everything moves back to where it began. But that doesn't mean that that's a problem, because if I undo that and I go to another key down here, IK is off. So this is, I've made a slight change using FK, which is by just selecting and rotating the nodes. Then I go down here to a new keyframe and I turn on IK. You'll see what happens is, first off, it should create keys on these three IK chain nodes, which is the thigh, the foot, and the ankle. And I can change my effector. Let's change the left leg effector, left ankle. Move the foot here. And if you remember, we've already moved the keys back here. As soon as I turn this off and go back, it's kept the change that I made here, the odd change that I made. Let's make it more prominent. Let's make it up here and down here like that. And if I check where my effector is by clicking the right ankle, or left ankle, you can see my effector is still down here. So that foot should be trying to touch here. So this is an FK change. But by not turning on, the moment I turn on IK, it will update this keyframe. But if I go to a new keyframe and I turn on IK there, then the previous one isn't affected. It's only whenever you start making edits. So what that means is I can actually go back here. My effector's down here, but I actually made an FK adjustment here. But the moment I make a change to the effector, it's going to change the leg and try to solve the IK again. So there you go. But if I didn't do that, I can then go, to another frame, say here, and I can make another IK change like this. And then even with the IK on, I can go all the way back and I still have my altered pose. So just be aware that that's how the IK works. Whenever you make an edit, it changes the position of these three nodes and then keyframes them. The moment IK is off, you're effectively in FK mode again. The only difference is it can be, really like nice to leave it on all the time when animating, because then it's pretty predictable. As I say, you can use this button here to hide the skeleton, and if you don't want to see the controls, then you can turn off these. And you pretty much in the end end up with, actually no, we're fine. You can pretty much end up with what looks like your normal everyday FK character. So just turn each one off. Alright, so the last thing we'll do now is we're going to make our lives a little easier by making these guys selectable rather than having to go into the skeleton tree. Okay, so we're back to where we began. Everything looks great. Let's turn off the IK. So what we're going to do is create a model for this. So I'm going to create a new model and I'm going to call it effector red, and we'll have effector blue as well. So let's make the red one first. Let's make it 6 by 6 by 6. Let's see what that gives us. And because I know the length of the nodes is the y-axis, I can probably change this down to 1, and this should give me the shape I want. So what I'm going to do is fill this with a voxel color. We'll give it red. I'm going to fill it. And let's go back to, let's make sure our pivot is in the center. So right click, set to center, undo, save. And what we're going to do is drag this onto these guys here. So I'm going to select all 4 like so, and see what I get. Okay, looks pretty good. So what this allows me to do is when IK is on, I can just select this model, and that is the effector I'm selecting. And the nice thing is if I delete it before I'm finished, it won't be exported to my workspace. Okay, so let's undo that. Let's make it even more visible. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove part of it. But it's easy to see then. And then you could have blue for one side and red for the other. But let's just see with the IK on. Let's move this hand down. Okay, so I might want to, as I mentioned before, this is sometimes a good way to work out your constraints. You might think there's too much twist in this, so that might more be that the range needs to be something like 90, 360. That's the starting point of the elbow. So let's see. You can see the elbow can go in and it can go out, but it's not as extreme as it was a moment ago. Okay, so I hope this has been helpful. I think pretty much that covers everything. Enjoy using the IK.